The sun set slowly over the small suburban town of Woodside, its golden rays slipping behind the distant hills. The Mitchell family home stood on the edge of the quiet neighborhood, a once pristine house now bearing the weight of secrets too heavy to hide. Linda Mitchell had always prided herself on maintaining the perfect family. 3 children, a devoted husband, and a life that seemed to anyone who looked in from the outside to be idyllic. But the cracks had begun to show in ways that no one, especially Linda, could have ever anticipated. It all started a few months earlier when Emily, Linda's stepdaughter, had returned home from college with a telltale glow that was impossible to ignore. Emily, a bright and lively young woman, had always been the picture of youth and innocence. At 22, she had the world at her feet, or so Linda had thought. It wasn't until Emily's doctor's appointment that the truth came crashing down like a thunderstorm. "I'm pregnant," Emily had whispered, in a voice so small it barely registered. Linda stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to process the words. The room seemed to close in around her, and she could barely hear the questions she was asking herself. How could this be? Emily was always so careful. She had plans. There was no room in her life for such an unplanned, life-altering event. The moment Emily had spoken those words, Linda's mind had been overwhelmed with confusion, but also with a sense of foreboding. There were so many questions that were too hard to ask and too painful to answer. But before she could even voice her disbelief, Emily's confession grew more complicated, but worse. Concerned for her health, Emily had spoken to her before she arrived. Linda's constricted will and a hopeful look had begun to... Yes, Jonathan's. Emily's voice trembled, and Linda felt the earth beneath her shake. Jonathan was Linda's husband, the man she had been married to for over 2 decades. The man who had always seemed like the rock of their family, the one who would never falter, never make a mistake. How could this be true? At first, Linda thought Emily was joking, but the look in her eyes told a different story. She was terrified, ashamed, and lost. The room, which had once felt so comforting, now felt like a prison. Linda's mind raced as she tried to understand the magnitude of what was happening. Could it be true? Was her husband, the man she had spent years building a life with, capable of something so vile? The evening unfolded in agonizing silence. Linda sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand, unsure whether she should call Jonathan, confront him, or simply wait. But waiting felt like the hardest thing to do. The minutes dragged into hours, and Linda's thoughts were consumed by nothing but this new reality. The possibility that her life had been a lie began to sink in. Jonathan had always been distant in recent months, but she had brushed it off. He had been working late, a few extra meetings, long business trips. But now it all made sense. Everything she had ignored, the signs that had once seemed so small, were all connected. It was all part of the same twisted story. Jonathan didn't come home that night. He didn't come home the next day either. Emily sat quietly in her room, ashamed and isolated, and Linda tried to process the horror of what had been revealed to her. But no matter how she turned it over in her mind, the reality was clear. Jonathan had betrayed her. Not just with another woman, but with her own daughter. The next few days were filled with chaos, as Linda tried to grapple with the truth and Emily hid from her emotions. Emily had never imagined such a thing would happen, nor did she have any answers to the questions that swirled in Linda's mind. It wasn't just the pregnancy that tore at Linda. It was the realization that the man she had loved for so long, the father of her children, had destroyed everything for a fleeting affair. Jonathan eventually returned home, but the confrontation was unavoidable. Linda didn't ask him about the affair, not yet. Instead, she told him in no uncertain terms what had been revealed. His face paled, his lips trembling. His eyes darted to Emily, who sat in the corner, staring at the floor. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. "I never meant for it to happen," Jonathan began, his voice shaky, as though trying to explain the inexplicable. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." Linda's breath caught in her throat. "A mistake? A mistake is dropping your keys or forgetting an anniversary, Jonathan. This is a betrayal of the worst kind. You didn't just make a mistake, you lied to me for months, and you've shattered everything I thought I knew about our family." Jonathan looked away, his guilt written plainly on his face. "It's not like I'm proud of it. I don't even know how it happened. It was one moment of weakness, and it's ruined everything." Linda's mind screamed with rage, but there was something deeper within her too, a devastating sense of betrayal that made her question everything she thought she knew. The years, the memories, the quiet moments she had shared with Jonathan, they were all tainted now. And Emily, her own daughter, had been caught in this web of lies. Linda didn't know whether to blame her or feel sorry for her, but the pain was unbearable. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the house became unbearable. Linda withdrew into herself, her heart a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, disbelief. Emily retreated into her room, refusing to speak to anyone. Her pregnancy, once a joyous occasion, now seemed like the ultimate reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Jonathan tried to redeem himself, but the damage was done. He went to counseling, promised to do whatever it took to make things right, but Linda couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage was irreparably broken. The trust, once the foundation of their relationship, was gone. Emily's pregnancy was a constant reminder of Jonathan's betrayal, and Linda couldn't bear to look at her husband without seeing the truth in his eyes. It wasn't just the affair that destroyed their family. It was the lies, the secrecy, and the way Jonathan had chosen to destroy everything for a moment of weakness. Emily's pregnancy was a reflection of everything that had gone wrong. It was a painful, unspoken acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same again. Months passed, and as Emily's due date drew closer, the tension in the Mitchell household reached its breaking point. The emotional toll was taking its toll on everyone involved. Emily was torn between her love for her family and the reality of her situation. She had tried to keep the truth from everyone for so long, but now she couldn't hide anymore. She was going to be a mother, but she couldn't forget that her own father had played a role in the destruction of her family. Finally, the day came. Emily went into labor in the middle of the night. Linda rushed to her side, her own emotions a whirlwind of love and anger, of fear and hope. She could no longer hold on to the anger she had harbored for so long. Emily needed her, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. They went through the motions of childbirth, the nurses, the doctor, the sterile environment that should have felt like a new beginning, but instead felt like the final chapter of a once beautiful story. The birth was a quiet one, marked by whispered words of encouragement and the occasional tear. As Emily held her newborn daughter, a tiny girl with dark hair and wide eyes, Linda finally allowed herself to embrace the love that still remained within her. This baby, her granddaughter, was innocent, untouched by the mistakes of the past. And in that moment, Linda realized that she still had the power to rebuild, even if it meant doing so without the man she had once called her husband. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Linda knew that healing would take time. She knew that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. Jonathan had made his choices, and now they all had to live with the consequences. The family was shattered, but they were still a family. There was still love, but it was different now. fractured in ways that would take years to repair. As the days turned into months, and the months into years, the Mitchell family slowly began to heal. Jonathan and Emily, once strangers in their own home, slowly found a way to rebuild their relationship. But Linda never forgot the betrayal. It had changed her. It had changed them all. And while they had learned to live with the scars of the past, there were some things that could never be forgotten. The Mitchell family, once whole, was now forever altered by the choices of one man and the sins that tore them apart. As time passed, the echoes of the Mitchell family's broken past continued to reverberate through their lives. The baby, whom Emily had named Grace, became a symbol of both new beginnings and painful reminders of what had been lost. Her bright, innocent eyes, full of wonder, offered Linda a chance for redemption, a chance to love again without the baggage of betrayal. But every moment with Grace was bittersweet, as it carried with it the weight of the circumstances surrounding her arrival. The years that followed were a mix of healing and unraveling. Jonathan, in his desperate attempt to win back his family, threw himself into work, hoping to avoid the difficult conversations that were still left to be had. But no amount of hours spent at the office could erase the fact that the foundation of their marriage had crumbled beyond repair. Linda had changed, and the woman who had once been so devoted to her husband was now someone different, more guarded, more independent, more unwilling to trust. One evening, as autumn descended on the town of Woodside and the air turned crisp, Linda found herself sitting in her kitchen, staring at the fading light through the window. It had been over a year since Emily's baby had been born, and yet the rift between her and Jonathan had not healed. The silence between them, once filled with the mundane hum of everyday life, was now deafening. Their marriage, once full of laughter and love, felt like a distant memory, something lost in time. "Linda, we need to talk." Jonathan's voice broke through her thoughts, but his words felt hollow, rehearsed. It was a phrase he had uttered countless times over the past year, but each time, the conversation always fell flat. What more was there to say? What more could be salvaged? She turned to face him, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on his face, making him appear older than she remembered. His hair, once thick and dark, was now streaked with gray, his eyes tired from the weight of the guilt he carried. Linda couldn't bring herself to feel sorry for him anymore. She had spent so many nights crying for the man who had betrayed her that there was nothing left to mourn. "I know we've been through a lot, but I still want to try," Jonathan said, his voice softer now, vulnerable in a way that made Linda recoil. He had apologized so many times that the words had begun to lose their meaning. What good was trying if the trust had already been shattered? Linda stood up from the table, pushing her chair back with a force that startled him. "Trying won't fix anything, Jonathan. You can't just keep asking for forgiveness without changing. You took everything we had and threw it away for a fleeting affair. I don't know who you are anymore." His shoulders slumped as if the weight of her words had finally crushed him. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I made a terrible mistake. And I've regretted it every single day since." She shook her head, her throat tight with emotion. "I know, but regret doesn't change the fact that you destroyed our family. I can't just go back to the way things were. I don't know if I even want to anymore." Jonathan's face twisted in pain, but he didn't argue. He knew that this moment had been coming for a long time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Linda's heart, once open to him, had now closed, and no amount of apologies could open it again. They had both changed in ways that were irreversible. "Maybe it's better if we just let go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been holding on for too long, pretending everything is fine when it's not. The silence that followed was heavy, like a weight settling in the room. Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I understand, but I will always love you, Linda. I hope one day you can forgive me." Linda didn't answer him immediately. The truth was, she didn't know if forgiveness was even possible. She had spent so many years loving Jonathan, believing in him, and now all she could feel was the emptiness that had replaced what once was. Forgiveness wasn't a simple act, and it wasn't something she could offer without truly healing. And right now, she wasn't sure that healing was even possible. The days that followed were quiet, marked by an uncomfortable distance that grew between them. Jonathan moved out of their bedroom, sleeping on the couch, though neither of them had mentioned divorce. They were stuck in a limbo, two people who had once shared a life, but no longer knew how to navigate the ruins. Meanwhile, Emily tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in her own life, though it was increasingly difficult. She loved Grace with all her heart, but the weight of her situation, the pregnancy, the affair, the family turmoil, was taking its toll on her. Every time she looked at her daughter, she was reminded of the one mistake that had torn her family apart. No matter how hard she tried to focus on the love she had for Grace, she couldn't escape the guilt and shame that constantly gnawed at her. One night, as Emily sat in the nursery, rocking Grace to sleep, she heard a soft knock on her door. She looked up, surprised to see Linda standing there, her face weary but gentle. There was something different in her eyes now, a softness that Emily hadn't seen in months. "I've been thinking," Linda said, stepping into the room and sitting beside her. "I know things have been hard, and I know that we can't erase what happened, but I want you to know that I'm not angry with you anymore." Emily's heart ached at the words. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I ruined everything." "No," Linda said firmly, shaking her head. "You didn't ruin anything. Jonathan did. You were just as much a victim in this as anyone else. You didn't ask for any of this, and you don't have to carry the burden of his mistakes. I'm not angry with you, Emily. I'm angry at him. He's the one who betrayed us both." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked at her stepmother, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and regret. She had spent so long believing she was the cause of their family's downfall that hearing Linda's words was a balm to her wounded soul. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone in her pain. "I've forgiven you, Emily," Linda continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know if I'll ever forgive Jonathan. I don't know if I can love him the way I used to. I don't know if I even want to try." The moment before she died, she said, "Open your eyes." The room fell silent as Emily held Grace close to her chest. She could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, but for the first time in months, there was a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But at least now there was a glimmer of hope. And as Emily gazed down at her daughter, she knew that, despite everything, she would find a way forward. They would all find a way forward, even if it meant living with the scars of the past. And so, as the years went by, the Mitchell family slowly started to rebuild, piece by piece, each member carrying their own wounds but learning to heal in their own time. Jonathan, despite his attempts, remained a shadow of the man he once was. He could never undo the damage he had caused, and neither he nor Linda could ever return to the life they had known. But they learned to coexist, not out of love, but out of a mutual understanding of the past they shared. For Emily, there was no easy answer. She loved her daughter more than anything, but the consequences of her actions would never leave her. The family, fractured and scarred, would never be whole again. But they had learned to move forward, one day at a time, in the hope that healing, however slow, would eventually come. As the years stretched on, The Mitchell family remained forever altered by the betrayal that had once torn them apart. Jonathan and Linda's now merely cohabitants rather than partners carried on in their family. Emily, now a young woman in her late 20s, had become the person she never imagined she'd be. A mother to Grace, a child she loved with everything she had, but whose arrival reminded her daily of her family's pain. She had learned to forgive herself, at least to some extent. She was no longer paralyzed by guilt. Grace, though still young, had already begun to sense the undercurrents in the home. She was bright, intuitive, and she would eventually grow into a confident young woman who would understand perhaps better than anyone else the complexities of the family she was born into. She would carry the legacy of that brokenness, but it would be hers to reshape. She would decide whether it would liberate. For Linda, the scars remained, though they had become less raw with time. She found solace in small moments of joy, in the love she could still offer her daughter, and in the quiet comfort of a life lived without constant turmoil. For forgiveness for Jonathan was something she knew she'd never surely offer. Jonathan, for his part, tried to atone. He worked harder than ever, tried to be a good father to Grace, though the cracks in his relationship with Linda remained unhealed. He never stopped regretting the choices he made, but regret, as Linda had once told him, was not enough to undo the damage, and so he spent his days alone in the house he had once shared with the woman he had loved, silently mourning the life he had loved. Even as he remained present for the family he still held together in the end, their lives didn't unfold in grand gestures of reconciliation or dramatic confrontations. It wasn't the story of a family that magically healed. It was the story of a family that, despite everything, carried on. They moved forward, each one finding their own path to growth, scarred but surviving, learning to live with the weight of the future. And that was enough. Because sometimes, in the aftermath of the most painful of betrayals, survival is the only victory that matters.